Good afternoon or good evening, depending where you're listening from all over the world. I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the International Committee of the Fourth International, the Socialist Equality Party, and the World Socialist website to this meeting, which commemorates a momentous event in world history, the Paris Commune, the first state created as a consequence of a working class insurrection that came into existence on Saturday, March 18th, 1871. On that day, the working class rose up against the bourgeois government's attempt to remove artillery that was vital to the defense of the city and thereby disarm the working class. The leaders of the bourgeois government, headed by Adolphe Thiers, fled the city and established its headquarters in Versailles. This was the beginning of the Civil War. 71 days later, on Sunday, May 18, 1871, the Commune was suppressed by the army of the Versailles government, which regained control over Paris by carrying out a horrific massacre of the city's working class population. In just the last 7 days of the Commune's existence, the bloody week of May 21st to 28th, the bourgeois Versailles army slaughtered more than 20,000 working people. Violence on this scale had not been seen in a European city in hundreds of years. Nothing comparable to this massacre would be seen again until the rampages of the Nazis between 1939 and 1945. The killings did not end with the fall of the Commune. The historian Albert Boehm has described the aftermath of its suppression. He wrote, "Although the Civil War ended on May 28th, the killing continued unabated. People were shot on the lamest pretext, and anyone accused of being a communard or who resembled a communard leader or sheltered an insurgent or anyone with blackened hands, which could only have been caused by a certain type of rifle, was in immediate danger. In the 2 days following the 28th of May, over 2,000 Parisians were summarily executed. Those taken prisoners and trundled off to Versailles fared little better. Confined to squalid cells and denied appropriate food and water, many died of suffocation, as well as from starvation and disease. An accurate accounting of the death toll is probably impossible, but a clue to its enormity can be seen in the government's subsequent admission that the Paris municipality paid for the disposal of 17,000 corpses. More French were killed during Bloody Week, May 21st to 28th, than during the Reign of Terror in the 18th century or the Prussian siege. In a recently published history of the Commune entitled Massacre, historian John Merriman provided this summary of the scale of the atrocities carried out by the Versailles regime. And bear in mind, he's describing the actions of a government that was defined as a Republican government, committed to the defense of democracy, bourgeois democracy. Merriman writes, after destroying the gates to the Père Lachaise cemetery on Saturday evening, Versailles troops stormed in. Many of the communard fighters there fell, some in hand-to-hand bayonet combat amid the tombs. Soldiers captured the rest and executed hundreds en masse, lining federal prisoners up, two against a wall, next to a very deep ditch. Machine guns did the rest, and many prisoners fell or were thrown into a mass grave. Georges Clemenceau later recalled that machine guns mowed down communards for 30 minutes without a pause. On Sunday, the Versaillais brought more prisoners for execution. They arrived in groups of 150, 200, and even 300 to be shot, many of them falling into the same wide and deep ditch that contained the bodies of communards killed in or after the fighting the day before. A subsequent survey carried out by members of the Municipal Council of Paris concluded improbably that more than 100,000 workers had been killed or imprisoned or had fled. This estimate may have been high, but the working class of Paris was inarguably depleted. In a comparison of 1866 and 1872 censuses, half of the 24,000 shoemakers, 10,000 of the 30,000 tailors, 6,000 of 20,000 cabinet makers, and 1,500 of 8,500 bronze workers were not to be found. The number of plumbers, roofers, and other trades that provided militant communards had often fallen dramatically. Well, after the Commune, industrialists and small employers complained about the paucity of artisans and skilled workers. What had motivated this staggering display of savagery by the bourgeois government without precedent in world history? Karl Marx, as always, writing contemporaneously, placed the massacre in its appropriate historical context. He wrote, "The civilization and justice of bourgeois order comes out in its lurid light whenever the slaves and drudges of that order rise against their masters. Then this civilization and justice stand forth as undisguised savagery and lawless revenge. Each new crisis in the class struggle between the appropriator and the producer brings out this fact more glaringly." But the story of the Commune is not only one of destruction and tragedy. The achievements of the Commune during the 71 days of its existence were of monumental historical significance, reverberating to this day. The form of the government created by the Commune and the measures it took heralded a new epoch in human history. The fact that the Paris Commune demonstrated the possibility of an alternative to the bourgeois state, indeed of all forms of class rule, in the final analysis accounts for the bloody retribution meted out by the Versailles regime. The effort to extirpate the Commune failed. For all the thousands and even tens of thousands of victims, the event had vast historical, political, and social repercussions. And indeed, the impact of this event initially found its clearest and most profound expression in the writings of Marx, who explained, even as the events were still unfolding, the significance of the Commune. The writings of Marx and also of Engels set a pattern that was to persist in the decades that followed. Every great Marxist who came into political consciousness either during and especially in the aftermath of the Commune, Lenin, Trotsky, Luxemburg, drew the most far-reaching lessons of this experience. They were inspired by its achievements and educated by an analysis of its weaknesses. Politically, intellectually, the Paris Commune prepared the path for the great October Revolution of 1917. Not only in the sense that all the leaders of the Bolshevik Party understood very clearly what awaited the Russian working class if the revolution failed, but they were inspired by the example of the Commune. They studied carefully the state form that it had created, and that provided really an outline for the measures which the Soviet state itself was to attempt in the aftermath of the seizure of power of 1917. As we will discuss, it is highly noteworthy that even as he was preparing the October Revolution in the summer of August 1917, in hiding, Lenin devoted himself to the most careful study of the writings of Marx and Engels on the Commune in the preparation of his own great study, State and Revolution. Now, there are many issues and facts and events which we will be reviewing today in relationship to the Commune. This can only be an initial discussion, but I think we have assembled a group of party members who have played a leading role in the building of the International Committee over many years, and who have studied the experience of the Commune and also of the Russian Revolution very carefully. So allow me now to introduce them before we begin the discussion. Our panel includes today Comrade Barry Gray, who is a 50-year veteran of the Trotskyist movement in the United States, and presently the editor of the US editorial board of the World Socialist website. We also have Comrade Thea Leclerc, initially from Australia, but who has spent many years of her life in France and has studied very carefully both French politics and the experiences of the Commune. And finally, we have Comrade Alex Lantier, who is the secretary of the French section of the International Committee, the Socialist Equality Party. I am David North. I am the national chairperson of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States and the chairperson of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist website. So let us begin. Perhaps, Alex, if you could give us a review of the political background of the Commune. What was it that actually took place on March 18th? What precipitated the insurrection in Paris? If you'd like to start with that, perhaps.
Yeah, well, the insurrection of March 18th, 1871 began when the capitalist republic, the Third Republic, led by Adolphe Thiers, tried to recapture cannons that were held by the population of Paris. You have a picture there that the Paris population had been armed, in fact, in the course of a war that had begun between France and Prussia, which was the sort of leading confederation in what is today Germany. And the French army was defeated. The Prussian army besieged the city. And the French, the capitalist government, the Third Republic, as it was called, wanted to negotiate a peace with Prussia, but they were also increasingly concerned at the fact that the working class had been armed in Paris, and they feared that they were not going to be able to reestablish control over the city. And this is a city that had been at the heart of revolutionary developments in France over a period, really of centuries. But of course, everyone remembered the 1789 French Revolution that overthrew feudalism and the absolute monarchy, and particularly the 1848 revolution, which had toppled the monarchy that had been restored by the defeat of France in the Napoleonic Wars, but that led to the first sort of major working class uprising in France, amid really uprisings of the working class across Europe, including also in Germany, Austria, and beyond. And so the government became extremely concerned that the population had become armed in the course of the war. They had heavy artillery, and it was necessary to disarm the workers as quickly as possible. And so the day before, the Thiers government decided that they were going to try to basically launch a dawn raid and seize the cannons that were on the hilltop at Montmartre. Unfortunately for them, they were found out by the population. It was a largely working class area surrounding the cannons, and the soldiers were intercepted by armed workers in Paris, and then workers from around all the surrounding neighborhoods began to cluster around this and argue with the soldiers against taking the cannons away, from disarming the city. The officers who were commanding the raid grew increasingly concerned. They were losing control of their troops. The troops were taking their rifles and putting the rifle butts pointing towards the top, indicating that they were not going to fire. The generals who were commanding the raid ultimately gave the order to fire anyway, but this backfired because the soldiers refused the order, and instead, both of these generals, who'd actually led the repression in 1848 and had participated in the killing of several thousand workers during the June days, were stood up against the wall, having ordered their troops, or having tried to order their troops to fire on the people. The workers there stood the generals up against the wall and shot them. And at that point, the Thiers government panicked. They said that they decided to immediately leave the city to go to Versailles, which is the old royal capital, about 10 kilometers outside what was then the Paris city proper, and set up a new government there, and try to reestablish control over the political situation and continue plotting against the workers in Paris.
Let's back up for a moment, just so the context is more clearly understood, because otherwise I think one can be somewhat overwhelmed by the factual material. First of all, I think it would be helpful to review the situation the months preceding. There had been the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, which resulted in the downfall of the antecedent regime, the regime of Louis Bonaparte, or Napoleon III, which brought a quasi-republican government to power. Would you just review that briefly, so those who are listening will have some sense of the different forces which were in contention?
Well, the 1848 revolution had ultimately ended in the coming to power of the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. He was the Napoleon III, as he was known, and he led a very repressive police state regime that worked in very close coordination with the Catholic Church, and that was also extremely concerned at the growing weight of the working class. And this was a period at which industrial capitalism was beginning to develop. The railroads were being built, where there was a huge influx of farmers from the provinces, also workers from Belgium and Germany, going to Paris to seek employment. And there was, an increasingly militant working class. And the Napoleon III regime was under ultimately enormous pressure. There were growing meetings in cities across the country, but in particular in Paris, political meetings that workers would attend, where they would discuss the fact that, the Napoleonic regime had suppressed the Republic, had betrayed the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and that the question was how were these principles to be realized, and the Bonapartist regime faced an increasingly impossible situation at home, with growing anger in the working class at enormous levels of social inequality, and also an unfavorable situation internationally, because increasingly Prussia was consolidating control and establishing itself as the leader of a powerful coalition of German states and seeking to unify Germany. And so the regime of Napoleon III decided that it would make a point, when Bismarck, the leader or the Chancellor of Prussia, indicated that he was interested in deciding who would name the leader of Spain, there was Napoleon III decided this was an outrage, this was an affront to France, and that France had to prepare for war with Prussia. And clearly there was on his mind both the international situation and, above all, sort of directing outwards the enormous class tensions were building up at home.
He had also been engaged, I might point out, in an attempt to establish an empire in North America. One of his adventures was the creation of a French empire in Mexico, and he had sent Maximilian down, which was a direct threat, of course, to the Union cause in the Civil War. But I think because of the complexity of this event, and the moment one starts speaking of 1870, 71, one inevitably winds up referencing antecedent developments. We're back to 1848, and somehow, I suppose it's inevitable that we are all anxious to plunge into the events of 1871, that one spends some time again reviewing the great historical experience in terms of the development of the working class. You might say the dress rehearsal for 1871, which was the 1848 revolution, the February Revolution, and then the bloody massacre of June 1848, and its influence on the development of Marxism, which is inextricably connected. Barry, if you could perhaps summarize the impact of 1848, specifically on Marx's analysis both of the class struggle in France and Engels' analysis of the class struggle in France, and why it came to be of such significance in his evaluation of 1871.
Well,
just again, before you begin, to give a context again, 1847, Marx and Engels write the Communist Manifesto, which very rapidly is confirmed by the eruption that takes place throughout Europe, but most, in a sense, most significantly in France in 1848, or in its most developed form in France, which is the first, you might say, great confrontation of the working class and bourgeoisie. So you could just review for us briefly the events and the major political conclusions or anticipations of Marx in his response to those events.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Well, first of all, I think that this certainly was one of those critical turning points, a sort of decisive experience, what we call the strategic experiences of the working class, but it really marked the entry of the working class as an independent and growing and increasingly powerful social force, developed by the development of capitalism itself, as Marx had explained, industrialization, and not just in France, but really, throughout Europe and also in the United States. It was still at a relatively early stage. But what happened was, of course, the regime of Louis Philippe, who was known as the Citizen King, who was installed, who replaced the monarchy, the restored Bourbon monarchy. It was Charles X, who was put in after the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, and the sort of restoration of the old, or the attempt by the major powers under Metternich, and to restore the old order, which they really couldn't do, but they attempted. In any event, there was that regime fell, the Bourbon King, and he was replaced by Louis Philippe. Philippe was known as the sort of, financier's king, completely corrupt, dominated by finance capital. Marx writes, in words that, the filth and the degradation of this regime. By 1848, this regime basically collapsed. And there was, in February, the February Revolution, the Declaration of a Republic, which was politically dominated by the rising bourgeoisie and middle-class elements, Democrats. But the working class was also on the scene, and the working class began to exert itself. It faced horrific conditions. There was a demand for relief for the unemployed, and this new regime set up national workshops. But the conditions of the workers continued, to deteriorate. And by June, there was an uprising of the workers themselves, with demands, essentially social demands, and clearly opposition to the regime. And this confronted the bourgeoisie, which in the past had been able to present itself as the leader of the oppressed of the nation against the old feudal aristocracy, with the reality that now they really couldn't do that, because they faced now a new revolutionary force was on the scene. And their response was absolutely savage. And there was mass repression. Thousands of workers were slaughtered. It was really, the first, it was kind of a, precursor, in all its horrificness, to what took place in 1871. But what was particularly significant, and this didn't only happen in France, it happened in Germany, it happened in Austria, and other countries where these revolutions broke out, is that the petty bourgeois Democrats, who had presented themselves as the spokespeople, the friends of the workers, supported the bloodbath, the counter-revolution. They lined up behind the big bourgeoisie. And this was a lesson that Marx and Engels felt was of immense significance, historical significance, which really had to be drawn out, because they understood that though this initial uprising had been defeated, that this really was the forerunner of a much greater struggle that was going to develop. And actually, it confirmed the basic premises of the Communist Manifesto. The conception of the class struggle being the driving force of social development, political struggle, the material basis of historical development, the laws, that this is a law-governed process. All of these things were initially confirmed in this great struggle, and they very sharply drew the conclusion. It's a very famous speech called the Address of the Central Authority to the League in 1850, in which they explained that the basic lesson was that the working class could not allow itself to be subordinated to either the bourgeoisie or the petty bourgeois Democrats, that it had to pursue its own independent struggle. And that struggle required a struggle basically for political power. And they further said that it had to be continuous. It couldn't just stop at
the first great reference to permanent revolution.
Permanent revolution and permanence. It had to go, it had to be spread throughout Europe in particular, the advanced countries, and until, as they said, in all of these major countries, it was the workers who were in power, and they could, on that basis, carry out the measures that met the basic needs of the masses of producers. So this conception of revolution and permanence was a major development, and then of course it was developed further by Lenin and particularly by Trotsky in his conception of permanent revolution.
Barry, there's an important letter that Marx writes to his comrade Wedemeyer in 1852, I believe.
Yes.
Perhaps you could reference that. If you could.
Yes, I think actually, I have it here. This was in March of 1852. And he writes to Wedemeyer, and now as to myself, no credit is due to me for discovering the existence of classes in modern society or the struggle between them. Long before me, bourgeois historians had described the historical development of this class struggle, and bourgeois economists, the economic economy of the classes. What I did that was new was to prove, one, that the existence of classes is only bound up with the particular historical phases in the development of production, and two, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society. So that was really an immense development, not of Marxist theory, but the programmatic basis for world socialist revolution. And so this was, an immense breakthrough. And that was the first time, I believe, that Marx used that phrase, the dictatorship of the proletariat.
So then following that, Marx, by the way, was exiled and by now is living with Engels in England. But let's consider for at least briefly the period between 1852 and 1870, that period of 18 years. Louis Napoleon comes to power in his famous coup, which Marx referenced in his book, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. If I may just insert here, parenthetically, I can't resist, but there are remarkable parallels between the events of 1851 described by Marx and what occurred in Washington, at least in the mechanics of it. Louis Napoleon came to power, he was the president, and he orchestrated a political coup, taking advantage of his control of the presidency to perpetuate his rule. He was not eligible under the existing constitution to run again for president. And so his coup perpetuated his rule, which was to last another 18 years until he collapsed as a result of the outcome of the Franco-Prussian War. But I want to now turn to Thea. And if you could tell us something about the changes in France and in Paris, particularly Paris, between 1852 and 1870, under Louis Napoleon. They're perhaps best known by people who visit Paris because of the profound change in architecture, which itself was politically motivated. But if you could just tell us something about the society, the changes in France in that very, very critical period. You have to unmute yourself there. Just one moment.
France was the, really, I think you can say, the leading city in Europe at that point. It had dominated things like fashion and style and ways of life. It had been widely imitated throughout the world. It had, following the French Revolution, there had been an immense impact on the surrounding countries. It struck fear into the hearts of all of the monarchies, and it ushered in a new era, really, that where no government was accepted uncritically, without close examination, and where social unrest developed apace. At the same time, you had the unfolding of an industrial revolution at different speeds across Europe, fastest, of course, in Great Britain, but every country was confronted with these very profound changes in the economic situation, as we mentioned. In France, it was a little slower, but you did have the emergence of industry. You had a great progress being made in science, the discoveries in chemistry. There were leading French scientists who discovered chlorine, other methods of creating raw materials for different manufacturing processes. So all this was going on, still dominated by the small factory, the small workshop. The majority of the workers were still artisans, highly skilled workers. But we did have now the beginning, there was a sugar factory extracting sugar from beets. There were chemical works. There were, as Alex mentioned earlier, the construction of the railroads, which, as a matter of fact, played a very important role in the Franco-Prussian War, actually to the advantage of the Prussians, who were paying very close attention to the use of the movement of troops in wartime. They had studied the Prussian military leadership, had very closely studied, as a matter of fact, the American Civil War, and noted with great interest the occasions on which battles were decided on the basis of the speed with which armies were able to move up their troops to the battlefield. This happened more than once in the American Civil War, and it was not lost on the German High Command. So what was taking place in Paris was the French Revolution had changed the governing body, that had changed the class in power, brought the bourgeoisie to power, freed it of what it found intolerable limitations imposed on capitalist property relations by the feudal system, and had created the conditions for a real burgeoning of capitalism. But of course, the great dilemma of the bourgeoisie is that you can't have capitalism without workers. You can't have capitalism without a proletariat. And the proletariat has interests that are completely opposed to those of the bourgeoisie. So this ushered in this period of very heightened class struggle. You know, I think when a lot of people look at this period in France, following the French Revolution and leading up to the Commune, it can be a little bit almost bewildering at first. The number of changes of government, the types, the different titles they call themselves. But as it's been pointed out, Marx and Engels gave us the key to making sense of all this, because what was taking place was the bourgeoisie was struggling to establish and develop its power, but confronting now more and more a class on which it was totally dependent, but which had its own independent needs and interests, and it began to express them. And that's
Let me
why
just
I pointed
Let
out.
me just stop you for a moment. First of all, before we continue, I want to point out we are receiving questions. We are going to be referencing them in the course of this discussion. Please keep on sending them in. And I also want to inform all our listeners that Mehring Books, our website at mehring.com, carries many of the titles which will be referenced in the course of today's discussion. So please do go to mehring.com and make your purchases. But let me just return to you again, Thea, because of course the Paris that exists today, or to a great extent, the Paris which are seen by tourists and many of its memorable sites, are not the old Paris that existed in 1848. It underwent a considerable reconstruction during the period of Louis Napoleon by Baron Haussmann. Would you perhaps discuss this? And it's not simply, or not so much its architectural significance, but also its political significance, some of the motivations underlying the reconstruction of Paris.
Yes, there were huge changes that went on architecturally and in city planning in the middle of this century. Baron Haussmann is the famous name. The great tree-lined avenues, the construction of modern buildings, really gave Paris its modern image. And one of the issues confronting the government at this time was the need to modernize. Paris had emerged as the center of all sorts of manufactures, even under the monarchy, luxury goods, et cetera, But now there was a different market, and it was necessary to adapt to what would become a world market for manufactured goods. And one of the things that's very striking about the redesign of Paris was the tearing down of many of the very narrow street cobblestone medieval sections of the city, particularly where the workers lived, and their replacement by these very graceful, elegant boulevards, very wide. And it was discussed at the time. In fact, Haussmann, when he would go to the government to get funding for his projects, which he had to do on more than one occasion, would explain to them that one of the things that this would facilitate would be the movement of troops against the workers in revolt. This was, you could say, common currency in Paris, in France, at that time, was the fact that whatever government came to power was going to confront a very restive working class that was entirely capable of organising insurrections, and it did it on many occasions. We've talked about a couple of the most significant, but this was something that the bourgeoisie lived with on a daily basis, on a moment-by-moment basis. And this was the basis on which, this was the sort of discussion that went on about the funding of these huge civil engineering projects. And it really transformed the face of Paris and gave it the look that it has today. At the same time, you had the development of a middle class, which had accumulated some wealth. And this was also influential in creating an ambiance under which all sorts of arts flourished: ballet, opera, opera comédique, and in the working class areas, all sorts of cafes, cafe life, popular music, all of these things developed. So a period of very rapid transformation. Yes.
Well, let me just ask Alex, as the person right now is living in Paris, if some other the elements, the political aspects of this as well, and the.
Well, so I think Thérèse has given a very clear picture of the, certainly there were economic concerns underlying the remodeling of Paris. It had to be somewhat more open to modern industry. But above all, the bourgeoisie lived, or the high bourgeoisie lived in constant terror of an uprising in the working class.
I just was, I have been reading about the arrangements of what you know in France as the arrondissements and the location of different populations. Did it produce a greater class stratification than had existed before? Was it in some ways more noticeable? Any perhaps parallels to the experience one would have in contemporary American cities like Manhattan? A segregation of the working class, a rich sector, a poor sector, and so on.
Very much so. In 1848, the classes lived at some extent side by side, and even actually still in 1871 there were some factories or workshops that were located in luxury areas of the city. But over the course of the Napoleon III's regime, Haussmann's remodeling, real estate speculation, there was the emergence of a sort of a new phenomenon in France. The working class neighborhood, the bourgeois neighborhood, the western areas of the city became largely luxury areas with a much wealthier population. In the east, along the St. Martin's Canal, which was where a lot of the raw materials and coal and other goods were imported for production. There you had sort of the working class areas where rents were lower, where even on a worker's salary you could try and get by. It was, certainly the bourgeois population appreciated having, nice tree-lined avenues. Paris introduced gas lighting. There were many advantages. Also, there were very much military considerations. One of the facts about Thiers' biography, the biography of the man who led the crushing of the Commune, was that he helped design the city walls of Paris actually right before the 1848 revolution. And it was pointed out that, there's Adolphe Thiers, that actually the gun emplacements were rather unusual, because not only the guns could shoot out from Paris, but they could also be turned around and so that they could be used to shoot in at the city, and that was highly unusual for fortifications of a city to allow the city itself to be targeted. And Thiers famously said, it's an insult to this government that anyone would ever think that I could, or that any government could fire on its own population. Of course, shortly afterwards in 1848, but especially in 1871, that was precisely what happened. And so it was this.
Well, I want to go from here, since we're giving something of a background, and one point which can't be emphasized too much in terms of the architectural implications and the military implications of the change. Therese has suggested this. The revolution of 1848 was centered on barricades and street fighting. So clearly the redesign of Paris was to a great extent motivated by this experience. But I want to turn, and we have questions which have come in. For example, one reader has asked, a lot of the French working class was actually anarchist led, Kropotkin wrote about the Commune. The question I think would be very helpful, because here it becomes quite complicated, to discuss the political changes and the political influences working upon the French working class, artisan strata, petit bourgeois, in the run-up and in the beginning of the Commune. Alex, would you like to perhaps review this?
Yeah,
I mean, the names, of course, of the two most significant figures, if I just throw that, of course, Proudhon and also Blanqui. Proudhon's dead by 1870-71, but his followers are still very active. And of course, Blanqui. Would you explain what their role was, who they were, and their influence?
Well, Proudhon was Proudhon. He was a son of a farming family. He'd grown up, basically was somewhat self-taught under the restored monarchy, and began sort of studying the sort of question of property, the question of equality, and he was basically, now he's obviously considered as one of the founders of anarchism, and he articulated with calls for a cooperative production. He famously declared that property is theft. He articulated the dissatisfaction and the anger felt by many small shop owners, workers in the smaller shops at just the enormous levels of social inequality, and the attempts to somehow shield the economic activity of many sort of petty producers from the crushing weight of the banks. And I think famously Marx polemicized with him on when Proudhon had written on the philosophy of poverty, and Marx made a very profound critique of Proudhon's conceptions, because above all, what was lacking and what really was unique to Marx's analysis was the materialist conception of history, and the emphasis on the role of the working class and the revolutionary role of the working class in struggle against the capitalist system as a whole. I think but Proudhon's works were well known to sort of politicized Paris workers, and so were those of Blanqui, who was a man from actually a fairly prominent family in the French Alps near the border with Italy, who had gone to Paris also under the monarchy and had been active in many different revolutionary societies under the monarchy, calling to build a republic, and he was and to topple the monarchies and replace them with the republic that had been proclaimed by the 1789 revolution. He spent many years of his life in jail for his sort of constant attempts to foment insurrections. He had a sort of the conception of a sort of a small group of people by conspiring could incite a sort of rioting and a revolutionary situation which dedicated groups of people could seize power. And I think clearly there as well, it was not really a Marxist conception, in that he sought to, the leadership that he sought to build was not a leadership mobilizing the entire working class, but one which was seeking to carry out sort of a political change, more or less in the forms of the regime, and that concentrated on sort of the republic, and was not focused on the question of the overthrow of capitalist property. But certainly he was a fighter for revolution against the monarchy, against the Napoleon III's regime, and he was also very well known amongst sort of radicalized Paris workers, and so was Marx. And I think
I can ask you about the International had been founded in 1864. What presence did Marx's followers, or those associated with the International, have in Paris, in France, at the time of the Commune?
Well, there was a bureau of the First International, the International Workingmen's Association in Paris. Now, of course, one thing to keep in mind, and I think this is the political culture of France at the time, was very much dominated still by the heritage of the French Revolution. So there were no political parties. There were clubs where you could come to discuss issues. There were mass meetings, but there was no political, as you know, would happen later after the Commune. There was no party that was the section of the International Working Men's Association in France. Individuals joined the International. There was in Paris, there was a bureau that had actually a fairly sharp division in it between sort of workers who were oriented more to strike activity, in sort of and said that there had to be more work done among industrial workers, those like Valin, who were a somewhat younger generation. And then there were also many people who were basically looking to develop, somewhat like Proudhon, a sort of mutualist, they were called, or sort of cooperative economy theories. And of course, they all coexisted. And they testified to the growing influence that Marx's writings had at the time, and of course there were also others in many of the major cities and provincial cities like Lyon, Marseille. There were followers of and members of the International there as well. But I think it wasn't sort of a political culture where you had quite such a sort of well-defined movements and parties as today. And so obviously these
because this leads us into the situation 1870-71 and the actual coming to power of the Commune, and the political situation and the evaluation of the measures they did or didn't take. So the first I'd like to just ask about that was this insurrectionary movement, which obviously found such an advanced expression in Paris. Was this an isolated, or was it a more general phenomenon? Anyone who'd like to answer this or speak to this, just I can see if you raise your hand a bit, then I can just call. Who'd like to take this up? All right, Alex, you can start. How broad-based was this movement?
Well, very rapidly there was the Franco-Prussian War, the Franco-German War, as it's sometimes called, led very rapidly to a defeat. Napoleon III was incompetent. The artillery in France was far outweighed by surpassed by the German artillery, and it was very rapidly a disaster. And there were very soon protests breaking out against Napoleon III around the country. There were protests, even insurrections for a time in the two largest cities in the south, Lyon and Marseille, also Narbonne, Limoges, a number of sort of smaller regional centers. Obviously, the north was very rapidly occupied by the Prussian army. But there was obviously explosive discontent and a political opposition. And the Napoleon III had been completely discredited by his defeat. And Paris was besieged in the lead up to the Commune by the Prussian army. It was basically, people there were starving. 11,000 people died during the siege of Paris from starvation, primarily children and the elderly. And as this was unfolding, protests. Sometimes there were a couple regions where there were sort of Republican detachments that were set up and that marched against the French army units in the south, calling for the immediate installation of democracy. So really throughout the country, there was a very explosive political situation. And then the capital, which was certainly the financial centers, in many ways, the industrial center was besieged. And there the population had been armed, and the working class was armed. And so this made it an extremely explosive, situation where the heart of the situation, perhaps one could say, was in Paris, but clearly there were uprisings, and there was explosive opposition among working people across France to the government.
What was the possibility, or did a possibility exist, or did the Commune, once it established itself, or as it was in the process of being established, did it lose an opportunity? Why did Paris wind up as isolated as it was?
Well, I think clearly the military defeat and the fact that it was besieged by the Prussian army was made the situation very difficult. But I think one can say, and Trotsky makes the point actually in his essay in for the 50th anniversary of the Commune, that was written actually during the Russian Civil War after the October 1917 revolution, that had there been a clarified leadership, a party like the Bolshevik leadership, the defeat was not inevitable. I think it's obviously it's a tall order to work out, very precisely what the alternatives were. But clearly, I think one could say a number of things. First of all, even in the run-up to the declaration of the Commune and the insurrection of the 18th of March, between September and March of 1871, during the siege, there were repeated uprisings. At the same time, and street fighting in October of 1870. In January of 1871, there were mass protests and against in Paris against the government. But the perspective that dominated was still somehow that there would be the Third Republic had been formed actually just after the defeat, and that somehow this government of national defense would ultimately install a democracy with and without necessary and more than the sort of proper enforcement of the government's promises. And at the same time, the government, the French army, was crushing all sorts of uprisings in the provinces, and putting many left-wing workers in Lyon, in Marseille in particular, in jail. So I think there was a certain amount of time that was lost just because it was difficult at that point to really clearly see what was a revolutionary perspective for the working class that wasn't the forming of the republic, which is what everyone remembered from the French Revolution.
Marx was, for the beginning, very critical of what the Commune didn't do. Barry, you're nodding your head. Perhaps you want to review that. Some of the central points that Marx actually made.
Well, actually, okay. What the central points Marx made were, one, that the National Guard, which was mainly the armed workers of Paris, had the opportunity, when this insurrection at Montmartre stopped the attempt by the Thiers government to use the military to steal their cannons, which was really an attempt to disarm the workers and launch the counter-revolution right there. And there was an understanding of that, I think, broadly in the working class. Had the National Guard, the armed workers, was really in a position, if they had immediately, gone after Thiers and his army, they could have smashed it up. They could have taken care of this phony, really very hostile government of national defense.
But they actually would have had they could have actually arrested Thiers.
Yeah.
And as I understand, that there were many people who eventually were in the Versailles government who were simply allowed to leave Paris.
Yeah, and the other thing, actually, it just related to that. Now, Marx didn't say this, but I believe Trotsky said it in his Lessons of the Commune, that in fact, one of the real problems was that the working class was armed and actually had by default, the bourgeois government had fled. It was actually in a position to, before that, on September the 4th, when the regime of Napoleon III fell after the disaster in Sedan, that actually the workers could have actually, carried out a revolution then and taken power, but they were still under the influence of sort of petty bourgeois conceptions of democratic republic and so forth. But then after the beginning of the Commune, the other thing is that Marx was critical that the Commune did not seize the Bank of France. And as he said, and others said, this would have really given the workers a significant lever against the Thiers government and against the bourgeoisie, but they didn't do that. And also, which I think is interesting, because I know Trotsky, I think possibly also possibly Engels or Lenin. Anyway, Trotsky for sure was critical of the fact that that National Guard sort of organized the election for the Commune and formally handed power to the Commune too soon. That time, because the elections were held about a week later, could have and should have been really used to go after Thiers and his army and destroy them and establish, a commune at that point and spread, and then, have the possibility, not to say this was a sure thing, but have the possibility to take the struggle, into the other parts of France and to the countryside as well.
Let's, before we go in more into the military consequences and how this actually played out in the struggle, let's spend some time, because this is of immense significance, the measures taken by the Commune, what it was. And I'll ask Thea to speak first, but I do want to read one quotation from a letter written by the great realist painter Courbet, writing on the 30th of April, 1871. And he was one of the greatest of the artistic supporters of the Commune. He wrote, "Paris is a true paradise. No police, no nonsense, no exaction of any kind, no arguments. Everything in Paris rolls along like clockwork. If only it could stay like this forever. In short, it is a beautiful dream. All the government bodies are organized federally and run themselves." Perhaps that's an introduction. It might be somewhat of a glorified view of the situation. But Thea, what was the Commune? What was new and different about it?
The bedrock of support for the Commune came from the working class in the city and the immigrants who had taken refuge in France, mainly from Poland, Italy, places like that, and also internal immigrants who had fled, who had come from parts of France that were occupied by the Prussian troops. So the policies of the Commune really bore the stamp of the working class. And there are two aspects to it, I think, that we should take particular note of. As we've discussed so far, the working class was living in poverty in this period. There were, of course, different degrees of this, but this had been made much worse by the war and, of course, by the terrible siege of Paris that the Prussians had imposed. So one of the tasks of the Commune was to attempt to alleviate this, and the policies were very clear on in this respect. Debt relief. They ordered the return of all workers' tools from the pawn shops, because people were just about destitute by now and were having to pawn even the tools that they were that they depended upon for their livelihood. Many employers had closed their factories and fled in the face of the Prussian advance. So the Commune took the step of giving the employees, the workers who were now unemployed, the right to reopen those factories under workers' control, to run those factories, postponement of certain debt obligations, rent, etc. But the second point is the Commune also looked towards a different type of society. And this was very clear in the policies that they put forward, that they disbanded the standing army. They transformed to the extent they could the nature of the police. They insisted on the separation of church and state. This, one of the real thorns in the side of the working class at this time was the question of education, because education had been entrusted. I spoke earlier about the sort of compromise that the bourgeoisie entered into with these remnants of the feudal aristocracy, the leftovers of the monarchy, also the church, very hated. The church was entrusted with the responsibility to conduct education. The policy of the Commune was free, compulsory, and secular. Child labour was abolished, night work in bakeries, conditions of workers were paid attention to, and the limits were placed on employers. They were in the habit of exacting fines against their employees on various pretexts. So very, very strong working class stamp on these policies, and at the same time, for all the limits in the in the conception of what sort of society was needed, the policies of the Commune clearly point in a more progressive direction towards a different type of society. At that point, out of population of about 2 million people in Paris at that time, if you look at the most recent census, 1869, there were 500,000 industrial workers, so 15% of all the industrial workers in France, plus another 300,000 to 400,000 workers in other enterprises. A very small percentage of workers were employed in large factories. Most were in small industries, textiles, furniture, construction. There were also 115,000 servants, 45,000 concierges. And there were also this 100,000 immigrant workers and political refugees, as I mentioned, from Italy and Poland. And one of the things that the Commune did was to really take a stand for internationalism, welcome those immigrants, equal rights, and even positions of authority in the Commune and in the running of the Commune. So still a lot of artisans and small shops in off streets, you know, but a very marked sort of ethos about all of the policies. That's what I'd say at this point.
And of course, many of those who had this international background were the subject to ferocious repression. Inasmuch as it plays such a significant role in the theoretical foundations, let me just read certain passages from actually Karl Marx's first draft of his speech on the Commune, which he wrote in April 1871. There's certain, I think, very, very important passages. He speaks, first of all, he speaks, and this comes, in fact, Barry will talk about this, his letter to Kugelmann, which he writes during this period. But he says in this letter, referring to all previous revolutions, he says, all revolutions thus only perfected the state machinery instead of throwing off this deadening incubus. And one is struck as one reads the writings of Marx, how focused he is on the nature of the state itself and its role in the suppression of society. And then he writes, talking about, you know, as he describes the alienation of the state from society, he says the following: the Commune, the reabsorption of the state power by society as its own living forces instead of as forces controlling and subduing it by the popular masses themselves, forming their own force instead of the organized force of their suppression, the political form of their own emancipation, instead of the artificial force appropriated by their oppressors, their own force. He says, gone is the delusion as if administration and political governing were mysteries, transcendent functions only to be trusted to the hands of a trained caste, state parasites, richly paid sycophants and sinecurists in the higher posts, absorbing the intelligences of the masses and turning them against themselves in the lower places of their hierarchy, doing away with the state hierarchy altogether and replacing the cautious masters of the people by its always removable servants, a marked responsibility by a real responsibility as they act continuously under public supervision. And then he adds, making in one order the public functions, military, administrative, political, real workman's function, instead of the hidden attributes of a trained caste. Can you perhaps expand on this, Barry? What is Marx really getting at in its implications in the development of Marx's strategy?
Well, I think it's very profound, and this became very much at the center of Lenin's struggle under the most obviously, so to speak, in a certain sense, difficult conditions. I mean, he was in hiding in Finland underground. And the counter-revolution was, being developed. But he insisted, and he was fighting politically for a political theoretical clarification, very, very, in the most immediate sense, bound up with the struggle against the revisers of Marx's conception of the state, capitalist state, what the workers had to replace it with, along the lines of bourgeois parliamentarism. And there were a section of the leadership in the Bolshevik Party that essentially were adapting to that and were very resistant to an actual organized overthrow led by the Bolsheviks, and mobilizing the workers again to put, against the Kerensky government. And what he placed particular emphasis on were the extremely significant measures that were taken by the Commune, which really are fundamentally different from bourgeois democracy and bourgeois parliamentarism. And in many respects, it's opposite. First of all, of course, there was Paris noted, the disbanding of the army, essentially the virtual disbanding of the police, and making the police answerable to the Commune. That any government official, including the delegates elected to the Commune, could only get the average weekly worker's wage and nothing more, and that they were elected by universal suffrage, but then subject to recall at any time. They were completely answerable to their, to the workers, to the electorate, and also that it was not a parliament, that the government was both the executive authority and the legislative. It was, and that was quite significant. Lenin and Marx spoke with justifiable contempt about the feather bedding and profiteering and corruption that was already very prevalent, in bourgeois parliaments. And the significance was that this was a state. Lenin developed this understanding, and as did Engels. But this was a state of a completely unique kind. It had never existed before. This was a state of the vast majority of the population, which was to carry out its interests, its social needs, and defend the revolutionary government against the displaced ruling classes, to suppress their resistance. Like all states, it is an instrument of class rule. Every state, and Marx and Engels explain this, arises out of the development of society where at a certain point, primitive communism gives way to a society divided within itself, class society. And the irreconcilability of these classes leads to the emergence of this so-called public force, the state, which does not exist, and this is what they insisted, to reconcile the conflict between the classes, but rather to suppress the exploited class, but do it in a way as to the extent possible that doesn't continually sort of destroy, the society and the interests of the ruling class. But this was different. It was still a state, but it was the state of the vast majority, and it was based on the participation, the democratic participation, not simply, I think Marx even speaks about this, or Engels, electing every 6 years the representative of the bourgeoisie who's going to, lie to you and, oppress you. But the actual administration of society by the masses themselves. So it really represented a vast development and extension of democracy, and genuine democracy for the masses. And not only that, but it was the only state in history that actually was ushering in the abolition of classes, the ending of class society, genuine equality, genuine an ending to poverty and all of the horrors of capitalism, which would be made possible by the immense development of the productive forces of the wealth of society, which would be then used to better the masses, not to bolster the fortunes of the super rich.
But if we but now we come, I think your summaries are very, very clear and helpful. But we come to the issue of the suppression, and the other side was the absence of leadership and or the prepared leadership, and perhaps that found its most tragic expression in the military outcome. We can't discuss the Commune, and it's again, it's the lessons drawn without discussing what actually happened. I don't think there is even historically very much of a grasp or an understanding of the sheer scale of the violence that was deployed against the masses. I know there are questions coming in along these lines, and I don't have a quotation, but it should be pointed out that the reaction of the bourgeoisie in Paris, in France, was mirrored virtually throughout the entire, all of Europe, and even in the United States. The United States had just passed through its own civil war. The response of the American bourgeoisie, recorded in such papers as the New York Times, was one of absolute rage, where the calls for mass murder were almost as violent or as violent as those coming out of Versailles itself. Alex, can you talk about some of the military progress or the way this worked itself out militarily, and what then led finally to the tragic denouement of May 21st?
Well, there was a certain, when it talks about the weaknesses of the Commune, obviously important points that comrades have already made them about the criticisms that Marx and Trotsky and others made studying this defeat afterwards. But certainly one of them was the failure to develop a unified military command. There was the National Guard, which was selected basically by neighborhoods. Then there was the Commune itself that set up a military commission, and it was never really clear exactly who had overall military command. There were, different generals with, seemingly different levels of ability that were selected. Over the basically, whereas on the other hand, the Versaillais, they had a very clear strategy. I mean, they had enormous concerns about whether they could control the army, because there was a lot of sympathy for the communal, for the Paris Commune in the army, but they sought to isolate Paris. They sort of seized one sort of key fort leading, controlling the main routes south and west out of the city very early on. That the communal did not succeed in marching on to capture it. And then they basically fought to get back into basically artillery range of Paris, which took them basically until late April, early May. And at that point, they started bombarding Paris furiously. And they were very clear. There were the measures that were taken, that had been taken on expropriating factories, on providing food, all of to the population, all of and just generally, as comrades have made clear, I mean, the form of the Commune itself, these were all seen as an intolerable threat. There was a press campaign. There was international, but was used to poison opinion in sort of the units of the army that were selected for duty against the Communal. And the French government, which was negotiating with the Prussian government at the time, managed to get the Prussian government to agree to give them more troops to march on Paris. And ultimately, after a couple forts were seized on the sort of southwestern edge of the city, it was possible by basically by an act of treachery from one of the from within Paris to seize a portion of the city wall on the 21st of May. And at that point, that was the beginning of the Bloody Week, and the army.
How did they actually penetrate the wall? There was, as I've read, there was a lack of guard, or
that part of the wall, remarkably, was left unguarded, and there was a state official who was hostile to the Commune, but who had not left Paris, and who was probably working as a spy for the Versailles government in Paris. Sort of signaled to the army that they could actually cross the city wall there, and they did. They managed, and you can see at the sort of southwest end of the south, the sort of lower left-hand corner of the sort of colored city of Paris. On the map there, the blue arrows going in, that's the Porte de Saint-Cloud. That was where basically they managed to seize a portion of the wall, basically by carelessness and of the fact that the Communal just did not place their men sufficiently carefully around the wall and to guard it. So it was it was a pointing to really the lasting problems of leadership, organization, and centralization that existed in the Commune.
They poured in, and when did that breach actually take place? Do you know the date? It was,
I'm sorry, Dave, you just cut off for a second.
The breach took place, it was around the 15th, 18th of May, around that.
Well, actually the fort of Issy fell on the 9th. That was, and at that point, the city and the city walls were under direct artillery fire, and that, which was part of the reason that some of the Communal didn't want to go on the city walls, of course. But the actual breach took place on the 21st, where, because there was still an outer wall around Paris, which was held by the Commune. And it was Jules Ducatel was the name of the person who did it. He indicated at this point, you can come through this Saint-Cloud gate. It's not held. And at that point, on the 21st of May, the army marched into Paris and began a massacre like nothing that had ever been seen in France.
I just I would like to read some passages from the book Massacre, which is a very vivid and shocking account, which gives an idea of what was taking place. Merriman, the author, writes the following, and I quote, "Probably made more ruthless by fear, the Versaillais, that is the Thiers army, often killed Communard insurgents they discovered, regardless of whether the fighters put up resistance. On the Rue Saint-Honoré, line troops found 30 National Guardsmen hiding in a printing shop. They had thrown away their weapons and hurriedly put on work clothes, but that would not save them. The soldiers took them to the Rue Saint-Florentin and shot them in an enormous ditch in front of what remained of the barricade. Nearby on the Rue Royale, troops came upon 6 men and a young woman in National Guard uniforms hiding in barrels. They were thrown into a ditch and killed. Volunteers of the Seine shot 15 men and a woman at the Parc Monceau. When line troops reached the Place Vendôme, the fallen column elicited further reprisals against communards. They're talking about the fallen column of Louis Napoleon, who had surrendered or been captured. Versailles shot at least 30 people there. Then he refers to a lithograph of the great painter Edouard Manet, one of the greatest painters of that period. It says Edouard Manet lithograph Civil War, which he did during and in the aftermath of the Commune. I continue the quote, evokes the horror of the slaughter at the Church of the Madeleine, where the Versaillais gunned down about 300 communards who had taken refuge there. No insurgent escaped. At first glance, one might think that Manet was depicting in the image the tragedy of civil war in a general neutral way. However, the dead man, clearly wearing a National Guard uniform, clutches a piece of white cloth, suggesting that he and the others had tried to surrender. The Madeleine appears unmistakably in the background. Versailles troops seized on any evidence they could find of insurgencies. Soldiers gunned down 3 women after coming across several pairs of National Guardmen's pants in their apartment. A furrier on the Rue des Martyrs was allegedly executed because he had invited Piat, a leader, to his apartment 6 months earlier. When the man's wife protested, she was also killed. Investigating an elderly man investigating a light spotted in an upper apartment on the Place du Trône, soldiers found 2 elderly men drinking tea and shot them for no reason. Social class did them in. Versailles paid no mind to the fact that some of the communards they killed had a few months earlier fought for France against the Prussians and their German allies alike. In the 18th arrondissement, executions continued into Wednesday, even after Montmartre had been taken. On the Rue Murat, 2 Versailles soldiers followed a man into a house where he tried to hide. They shot him on the spot. The concierge asked them as they were leaving if they were simply going to leave the body there. When they answered yes, he paid them to cart it away. Each one took one of the man's legs, leaving his head to bounce on the ground as they dragged the corpse to a garbage heap. Onlookers applauded. On the Rue Montmartre, soldiers sought a communard captain. Finding only his 12-year-old son at home, they killed him. When a young man reproached them for the act, they shot him as well. Just one more quote on the death of Rigaud, who was one of the leaders of the Commune. I think he was head of the police. When he was taken, he said to his captors, "Here I am, it's me, me voilà," as he surrendered his pistol. Unsure whom they had captured, they found an officer who asked the prisoner his identity. Rigaud, a prize catch, gave them his name. When he shouted, "Long live the Commune, down with the murderers," the soldiers put him up against a wall and shot him dead. Rigaud's body lay on the ground. The so-called men of order who had shot him poked at it with their umbrellas and canes. Now, there's one question which we received asking whether members of the bourgeois class themselves participated in the slaughter. I believe they did. Alex, do you want to say anything about this?
Well, I mean, you mentioned the volunteers at the Seine. Actually, there was a special unit that was recruited, basically because many of the wealthy families in Paris, not all of them, but many of them fled to Versailles after the Commune was declared. And there was a unit that was recruited specifically among young men from wealthy families in Paris that were in Versailles and who were basically sent in to make sure that the army really and that the sort of largely peasant soldiers followed orders to kill the communards as the government intended. And so there was, I mean, it was a very explicit sort of class class war and class mass murder that was carried out in the course of the Bloody Week. And often they were responsible for some of the worst atrocities. They were also, I think, one has to say it was a general offensive against anyone who represented the working class politically, and the the treatment of Rigaud was repeated basically for all of the leading members of the Commune. Anyone who was caught wearing National Guard pants, anyone who was manning a barricade, they weren't given trial according to the laws of war. Tens of thousands of people were shot on the spot. And basically what are today known as sort of many of the best places to have to go have a walk, see and see tourist destinations in Paris, the gardens near the military school next to the Eiffel Tower, the Monceau Park, the Luxembourg Gardens, the Père Lachaise Cemetery. These places where there was sort of large open air locations, they were turned into mass killing grounds where dozens or hundreds of people could be brought at any one time and just gunned down by machine guns or by large firing squads. Or significantly often members of the property classes would show up and cheer on the executions. It was a truly horrific event. It was intended to strike terror into the hearts of the working class. You see here many of the dead were stripped naked and left to rot in the street, simply to intimidate people further. And there was a frenzy that sort of came over the bourgeoisie. One famous or infamous event was the Commune, and also the artillery of the Versailles government, of course, set a number of fires in Paris. And there got to be sort of a myth that was promoted in the bourgeois press in France and also internationally, that basically every working class woman in Paris was a pétroleuse, a gas lighter, and was setting fire to wealthy people's apartments or to major monuments in the city, and just trying to destroy everything. And as a result, there were a number of women who were killed because they were caught with olive oil, which was mistaken for petrol or gasoline, because they had asked for coal or something to burn the body of their husband or partner. It was a really an incredible mass murder that unfolded under the orders of the Republic.
And it should be pointed out again that this was in the city which at that time was viewed as a center of European culture. It was with great novelists, great painters. This was not in any way a underdeveloped society, this was an advanced society from which lessons itself must be drawn. And here we'll turn perhaps to the last minutes we have to discuss its impact on the Bolsheviks and its leadership of the revolution. I think, again, as we've made this point a number of times in previous discussions, it's always valuable to set a certain time frame so one can understand the historical interconnection of one generation to another. The Russian Revolution took place just 46 years after the suppression of the Paris Commune. Trotsky's famous speech toward the end of the Russian Civil War was given 50 years after the Commune. From our vantage point, if we think in similar timeframes, just about the same, somewhat less, separates us from the events in Chile under Pinochet, which, by the way, for all its horrors, didn't approach the level of the Commune in Santiago. But all of the leaders of the Bolshevik Party, all the great Marxists of that day, grew up well aware of what had happened in France. And when the Bolsheviks demonstrated contempt for bourgeois public opinion and its conventional denunciation of revolutionary violence, they knew the ruling class for the hypocrites they were. I just want to quote one speech from Trotsky, which he gave in 1918, which as much as any theoretical document he wrote indicates, you might say, the emotional, moral, and practical political impact of the Commune on the thinking of the Bolsheviks. And he said the following: "History is no indulgent, soft mother who will protect the working class. She is a wicked stepmother who will teach the workers through bloody experience how they must attain their aims. The working class is readily inclined to forgive and forget. It is enough for the conditions of struggle to have become a little easier, enough for them to have won something, for it to seem to them that the main job has been done, and they are disposed to show magnanimity, to become passive, to stop fighting. In this lies the misfortune of the working people. But the possessing classes never give up the struggle. They have been educated to offer constant opposition to the pressure of the worker masses, and any passivity, indecision, or wavering on our part results in our exposing our weak spot to the blows of the possessing classes, so that tomorrow or the next day they inevitably launch a new onslaught upon us. The working class needs not the universal forgiveness that Tolstoy preached, but hard tempering, intransigent, profound conviction that without struggle for every step, every inch of the road leading to betterment of its life, without constant, irreconcilable, harsh struggle, and without organization of this struggle, there then can be no salvation and liberation." Then he says the following: "It is for this reason that we are calling into the ranks of the Communist Party, first and foremost, workers who are filled with clear understanding of the tasks imposed by history upon the working class, and then after them, all the devoted and reliable friends of the working class. Let him who has doubt or hesitation in his heart stay out of our ranks. It is far more useful for us to have one well-tempered fighter than 10 irresolute ones, because when the fight begins, the 10 irresolute will surround the one well-tempered fighter and hold him back. If the more resolute, welded into a single fighting team, hurl themselves against the enemy, they will in their wake draw the waverers into the fight." I think when one reads that passage, one can hear the echoes of the experience of the Paris Commune. Barry, do you want to say something more about the theoretical lessons of the Commune, or how this expressed itself in the policies and writings of the Bolsheviks?
Yes, I do. But there was one other point I would like to make in regard to the virtual, almost near genocide carried out by the French bourgeoisie and its so-called Democrats in Paris. And because I know Marx traces this very concretely when he reviews in the beginning of the Civil War in France the actual sort of progression of events, that from the very beginning, as soon as with the fall of Napoleon III and the emergence of an armed working class in Paris, even as the Democratic Republic was being declared on September 4th, 1870, the government of Thiers, with the support of the entire bourgeoisie, really began plotting and conspiring with the Germans and with Bismarck to drown the workers in blood. And he explains, he details very specific things that were done, the suing for peace by Thiers, Alex mentioned the agreement with the Prussian troops, with Bismarck, to release 100,000 captured French soldiers who were captured at Sedan, and then they also released thousands of captured soldiers who were captured at Metz. And basically, what Marx makes the point, and quite correctly and very directly, that when it comes to their basic class interests, the bourgeoisie has no problem when they face the real threat of the working class overthrowing them and taking power, understanding who their enemy, their most important enemy is, and they're prepared to conspire with, their national enemy in war to drown the workers in blood. And that's a pattern that also was repeated in the Russian Revolution. And Lenin made a very specific point of that. I mean, just to some points. I mean, around the time of the attempted coup by Kornilov, who, as I say, was known to be a ferocious supporter of the autocracy, enemy of the working class, anti-communist, anti-Semite, allied with the Black Hundreds, and who was appointed by Kerensky after the July days crackdown and attempt to really drive the Bolshevik Party and its growing members and supporters in the workers and among the troops, to banish them and criminalize them. Anyway, so he was appointed, and along with that, and the coup was actually defeated because the Bolsheviks had won the really control of the Petrograd Soviet, and they were able to initiate the establishment of the Red Guards, get the agreement for their own reasons of the Mensheviks and the SRs, and defeat Kornilov, he ordered his troops into from the front to Petrograd, and they refused to come, and the Bolsheviks had agitators among the troops. By the way, this is shown wonderfully in the film Tsar to Lenin, which everyone should really see. Merriam Books has that film available, and these issues are dealt with in great detail in other books by Merriam Books. Why Study the Russian Revolution, the Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century by David, and really, hopefully, this webinar will encourage workers and youth who want an understanding and want to see the need for socialism to really study these events. But Lenin, the question of, and this is raised in the statement that Alex wrote that we published in the WSWS, and it's raised very centrally in David's writings on the Russian Revolution, the question of drawing the lessons of these immense events, these strategic experiences consciously, assimilating the lessons, bringing this into the consciousness of the broad mass of workers through the construction of a revolutionary party based on Marxism and based on these lessons and the principles established by Marxism, is the decisive question. And this was totally borne out and proven by the October Revolution. If it were not, Lenin was in hiding in Finland. The counter-revolution was progressing. Everyone knew that really Kerensky was in cahoots with Kornilov to smash the Soviets. And at the same time, the crisis of the bourgeois regime was growing by leaps and bounds. The war was creating a massive anger, growing anger. The Kerensky offensive had collapsed. The army was disintegrating. Support for the Bolsheviks was growing very rapidly in the Soviets. The workers, the factory councils already were controlled by the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks controlled the Petrograd garrison. But in this period of crisis, it was very clear that the issue of revolutionary or counter-revolutionary was going to be settled in a matter of days. And the most critical thing was to clarify politically the members and the cadres of the Bolshevik Party and the advanced sections of the working class on the fundamental strategic issue of the state alongside the question of internationalism. I mean, that was the critical issue. And so Lenin, in hiding, and he had been preparing notes on this, carried out this really remarkable review of the Marxist analysis of the state in order to revive this understanding, this revolutionary understanding, the need for the smashing of the capitalist state, not simply, taking it over as is and establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat, which against the dictatorship of the capitalists, in order to carry through the revolution, defeat the counter-revolution, and hold on to power. So on that basis, he armed and he had to carry out a very ferocious fight within the leadership of the Bolsheviks, because there was a right-wing faction which was really adapting themselves to bourgeois parliamentarism, led by particularly Kamenev and Zinoviev, with Stalin basically, wavering back and forth, but basically supporting them. And to the point where Lenin had to fight to get the approval within the Central Committee to set a date and begin organizing the preparations for the insurrection. And a week before the date, which was set for the October 25th, which the old calendar in Russia, which was the opening of the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets, because the organs of workers' power would be the Soviets, and it would help if this was carried out under the auspices of the Soviets. There were tactical differences between Lenin and Trotsky on that, but in the end, but anyway, a week before this, and this had been agreed by the party leadership, Kamenev published in a non-party journal by Maxim Gorky a statement opposing the plans for the insurrection. He did it with the support of Zinoviev. And, basically said this is suicidal, that, we should, oppose the provisional government, but wait for the Constituent Assembly, win a majority, and so on and so forth. Well, if that line had been prevailed, there would have been another bloodbath, and even greater than what happened in Paris. And, the proof of that is that after Cornelius' coup attempt failed, he was not, the government didn't prosecute him or anything. And he then became after the success of the revolution, the establishment of the worker state, very quickly the bourgeoisie in Russia, the old aristocracy, the old czarist, bureaucracy, with the open support of the imperialist countries that were at war with Germany, 13 countries. They sent armies in to aid the white counter-revolution. Well, they carried out atrocities, along the lines of what was described just before. And the commander—
there's a certain element of it. We're coming really to the end of the time. I just would like to stress in this, and every point you're making really is correct. There were vast lessons drawn, but there's, and of course the issue of leadership was fundamental. But I think it's also important to stress another lesson which was drawn, because the question of leadership can never be seen as if it's something which proceeds and develops apart from and outside of the working class. At the very end of his life, one of his last, actually, I think it's his last great essay, Engels writes another essay on the lessons of the civil wars in France. And he draws attention to the fact that as events of 1871 had already shown, the days of barricade fighting were over. A struggle between the classes would assume a far more monumental character of which is modern warfare. And he says the days, he's also answering the Blanquist, he says the days of sort of shock seizures of power, offensive by surprises are over. That if the working class is to take power, it has to be in its body and soul. It has to understand what it is facing. In other words, a revolution is not possible. And in fact, you can't even conceptualize the existence of leadership apart from an enormous development of the class consciousness of the working class, of which the party itself is ultimately an expression. It's important to keep in mind when speaking of the events of October and certainly their aftermath, it's not just that you have Lenin and Trotsky handing out directives from above. They are resting on and always speaking to a highly developed working class in the major industrial centers who both agree with and are able to implement and carry out that perspective. I mean, Trotsky's not just, he's delivering orders, whether by telephone or handwritten, to divisions in Petrograd, which are led by very advanced workers who themselves had gone through a vast experience, who, like Trotsky, had been educated on the basis of a whole antecedent experience. So I think this connection is extremely important. It wasn't just a few leaders who learned, the working class learned. I mean, in August 1917, the working class in Petrograd understood what would happen if Kornilov came to power. They understood that very, very clearly. And that was a decisive element. I mean, they learned the lesson, and the party was the most advanced expression of the lessons they had drawn. And I'd like to now
just add one thing real quickly. Can I just add one?
Yes.
And they had gone through an enormous experience between the February Revolution, when basically the workers overthrew the Tsar, but the opportunists who had the leadership in the Soviets at that point handed the power over to the bourgeoisie. But the Bolsheviks and Lenin and Trotsky and the leadership brought them through this, experience through which they
and they also had the experience of 1905 and the punitive expeditions that had been launched by the Tsar with the defeat of the 1905 revolution. We're coming to the end, and I just would like, if we can, since we have Alex with us, let's bring this perhaps up to date. What's the situation in France right now, in Paris?
Well, we've just been writing on the World Socialist website about the disastrous state of the pandemic. The fact is, the government, the Macron government, President Emmanuel Macron's government, has refused yet again, despite large public support for a policy of a lockdown, to implement a serious lockdown measure. The doctors, the most prominent medical authorities, are warning over and over that if there isn't a serious measure, there aren't serious measures that are taken, it will be only a matter of days before thousands of people are turned away from medical care. And with the overflowing of the hospitals, of course, even under the best of conditions, death rates will go up just because of the overwork of the staff. And I think the working class is again sort of being presented as coming face to face with the complete ruthlessness and indifference to massive levels of death among workers in the ruling class. And I think obviously there's I think there are many things that can sort of be said about it, but I think the sort of central point I think to emphasize is that the pandemic of COVID-19 has raised in the sharpest possible way again the question of building of the political leadership of the working class, you know, not only in France but also in Europe and around the world, because clearly what is involved. I mean, Macron it's well known. He's the president of the rich, and he is intervening to keep workers on the job so that the trillions of euros that have been handed out in bank and corporate bailouts get profits made on them. And I think it is sort of horrific to say, but it is going to be. I mean, France has already seen over the last year close on 100,000 deaths, and we are facing now in France and across much of Europe and the world a new surge in mass deaths.
Well, there's a saying in France, you're familiar with it, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they remain the same. 150 years after the Commune, 100,000 French people are dead. A large portion of that working class as a consequence of the pandemic and the indifference of the French bourgeoisie. And if one extrapolates to Europe, where the death toll is approaching 1 million, it's always the same, the indifference of the ruling class to the suffering of great masses of people. And nothing of that has changed. And so I think observing the 150th anniversary of the Commune, it is for us to draw the lessons of this vast historical experience and all that has passed since. I urge all those who are following this event or who will see it as it's available on the web, to also draw the lessons. Read the World Socialist website, study the works of Lenin and Trotsky and the works which are published on the World Socialist website. You have to look for it. We are, at this point, the most censored socialist site on the web. So you really have to look. But the lessons of this vast experience speak to the present situation very powerfully. I'd like you again to go to Mehring.com, which is our site where we sell literature. You will find many of the critical works referenced in this discussion on the site. We also would like to ask you to donate to the World Socialist website. Go to wsws.com/donate. We need contributions. And as we conclude, the most important thing is to draw the appropriate and necessary political conclusions. History is indeed a wicked stepmother. And the working class requires a leadership equal to the challenges of our time. Make the most important decision at all. Commit yourself to the fight for socialism. Join the Socialist Equality Party in the United States or in countries where it is currently active and where there is not yet a section. Take the initiative to begin the building of a party. Contact us. We will get back in touch with you. So with that, I would like again to thank all of the participants for in this discussion, Comrade Alex, Comrade Barry, Comrade Therese, and again, thank all of you who have listened and participated in this webinar. Thank you very much. Good afternoon.